Hello everybody, this is Graeme Anderson, and today I'm going to be looking at Mortum Medieval Detective. Now when I first purchased this game, I really didn't know anything about it beyond what it said in the back of the box. And there, in the very first sentence, it said it was a deductive adventure game. Right there, I was hooked. I love a good deduction game. And it's almost always an instant buy for me because I had a friend who enjoyed them as much as I did, and we would spend hours going through all the different various cases from the various games that I own. Unfortunately, they had to move away, and the other members of my gaming group were not as big into deduction games. But this one says it can play 1 to 6 players. So maybe I could solo it. Now, the game is set in a kind of an alternate medieval Europe. It feels like Europe through the theme, but there are definitely some magical things going on there. Now, the goal of the game is just to figure out what happened. You're going to go around talking to people, investigating locations, and doing various actions like searching or surveilling all through a deck of cards. Of course, almost every action takes time, and there are only so many hours before your superiors want an answer. So deciding what you want to spend your time on is really part of the challenge, kind of balancing the time versus how much information you need before you can make an answer. Now, I had really high hopes for this one. So, should this game be taken out to the dark alley and just left in the rubbish heap, or does it belong in a place of pride on my mantle? Let's get it to the table for a quick overview to see how it's played, and I've tried not to spoil anything during the overview. Then, of course, we'll come back for my final thoughts on Mortum Medieval Detective. So here are the components of Mortum. This is not a standard board game. There are very few components. There are just some tokens and 3 decks of cards representing the 3 different cases. These cards are the heart of the game. In this overview, I'm going to try not to spoil any of the game, so I won't be showing you any of the cards beyond the initial set of cards, as there are no rules, because all the rules are actually on the cards themselves. But you should still be able to get an idea of how this game plays. The first case begins by taking you through the setup and how the game plays, so we'll quickly go through that. You first place the time cards together with the time tracker, and you start the time tracker on 6 AM. Out of the 5 starting heroes, choose any 3 and return the rest to the box. These characters will be with you for the entire story arc. It doesn't matter how many players there are, you'll always select 3 characters. The front of each character is going to show a bunch of icons. You take the matching tokens from the general supply and put them into your personal supply. If you flip the characters over, it will give you a description of each of one of the icons too, and I'll briefly talk about the main ones, the search, the raid, and surveillance in a bit. They're going to separate the 3 decks, search, raid, and surveillance, and the rest of the cards are going to go into the last deck. The goal of the game is to piece together what is happening in each story. There is a mystery to be solved, and you'll be going to different places, talking to people, searching areas, and this is all going to be done through these decks of cards. You are given a time limit, and each action will usually give you a number of hours it takes to complete. Whenever you reveal a card, like this first one, you must move the timer by 1 time unit for each icon that it shows, then you read what happens. Here it's just a continuation of the rules. Now, if you do not rest by 6 PM each day, you're going to be accumulating fatigue. Being fatigued affects when you wake up the next day, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the rest action. Now, if we continue through the setup card, it tells us to flip over the next card and start the game. Sometimes during the game, you're going to reveal a piece of the map, like what this card says, so we're going to be adding card 25 to the center of the table. We also need, of course, to advance the timer by 1 step, because that's what the card shows. The card also says to take the next card. And I'm going to skip the rest of this card, but I want to show you the main way the story advances. At the bottom of many cards, there are actions you can perform. Now, as long as this card is in play, you can do any of those actions. So, from an initial camp card, we can camp for the night, visit the inn, the stable, or the farm. Now, whichever one we pick, we will find that card in the deck, advance the time marker if it says so on the card, and read the card to see if there's any further actions we can take. We can also see from this card that we have until 12 PM on the second day to wrap up the investigation. At the end of the investigation, you'll be asked several questions about the investigation, and depending on how you score, that can change the outcome for this investigation and can actually impact further investigations in this box. Really, the only other main piece of the game are the 3 other decks and the abilities your characters have. These are pretty straightforward and work in similar ways. For the search action, you flip over one of your characters that has the search ability, take one of the search tokens from your personal pool and place it on the location on the map you want to keep an eye on, then take another token from the general supply and place it 3 time units ahead of the current time. When your timer reaches the token, discard the token, flip your character back over to active, and take the card from the search deck that matches the location and read it. And the token is going to stay on the map. For surveillance, it works the same way, but you're going to be taking from the surveillance deck. And the raid is slightly different. You need to have all members of your party face up, that is, they can't be either searching or surveilling, and you place a raid token on the location on the map. You do not need to wait, you don't need to place a second one on the time tracker. Then, you take the appropriate card from the raid deck and read it. Now there are other tokens in your pool, the combat and the coin tokens, and you're going to be prompted via cards to spend these. If a card ever asks you to spend a combat token and you don't have it, you're going to be taking a fatigue token instead. When you finally decide to rest, you're going to add up all the fatigue you have from any tokens you've got, and from the red bars on the time track, depending on when you decided to rest. The rest card will usually then tell you what happens with your fatigue at the beginning of the next day. Usually it means you're going to be waking up later. Now you normally replenish your search and survey tokens overnight, but the combat tokens are only replenished at the start of the scenario, and coins are never replenished unless you find some during the gameplay. You will continue investigating, and when you feel you're done, or when the timer runs out, you'll have to answer questions and then score. If you fail to reach the minimum number of points as described in the scenario, you'll be prompted to replay the scenario. Otherwise, you get a closing card to read, and it usually details what's happened, and then you're on to the next scenario. And that's how you play. Let's get back to see what I thought about Mortum Medieval Detective.
So let's start talking about the theme and the components. I feel this game will live or die on its theme, and luckily, they did a good job on that. I was surprised just how much by the third game I was sucked into the theme and story this game was trying to tell. The theme is so integrated into the storytelling and the investigation that you are taking. Now, I don't want to go into any specifics to avoid any spoilers, but I found as the story went on, the more I was invested in the story and the theme. So for me, it gets high marks. For the components, there are two components I didn't show. There's a little notepad for taking notes. As you can see, I didn't use them. And there's a little kind of welcome letter, which kind of gives you a brief overview of very, very high level of how the game plays and kind of an FAQ on the back. Now, this is not a rules overview. It's just sort of, get yourself into a quiet room. Now, the cards themselves are good quality and easy enough to follow and read. And the important actions are pulled out to see, like the overview where it told you to put a map card in the player area. It's kind of obvious that that's a special action to do because it's kind of highlighted on the card. Now, I do wish that there was an actual rules refresher book or cards. I played the first scenario and left about 2 weeks before I did the other scenarios, and I needed to pull out the first scenario to kind of refresh my memory on how things work. Now, it's nothing too difficult, but I would have liked just to have a cheat sheet or the last few cards of scenario 1 as kind of just a rules reminder. I also wish that there was more art in the game. Often you get card after card of text. Now there are some cards with art on them, but I do wish that there was just more to help you draw yourselves into the setting even more. But overall, I was happy with the components. Now onto the gameplay, and this is a bit difficult to do. There's not a lot of gameplay mechanisms because this game relies so heavily on the story it's trying to tell and the mystery to be solved, which I definitely didn't have an issue with. And before I get much further, I did enjoy the game overall and had a fun time unraveling the mystery, so please keep that in mind as I go through some of my issues with the game. Now, I do have some issues with how the mechanisms actually worked. It's not so much the issue with the mechanisms themselves, but more of the results of them. First, there are the special actions, the search, the surveillance, and the raid. They kind of seemed arbitrary in their results. There was very few real indications that I found anyway to be clued in that you should be doing any of these actions. In the later stories, it's important to get information this way, but if you just talk to a person in their house, should you search, should you raid, or should you put surveillance on it? I felt like sometimes it was just guessing. Sometimes it paid off, and sometimes it was just wasted. I guess that could be seen as thematic, that you're chasing red herrings. Now, the only other mechanism I had an issue with was the whole time aspect and the fatigue. Getting fatigued during the day usually just resulted in waking up later the next day. So I kind of felt it was pointless to push the days beyond the 6 p.m. deadlines. Now, sometimes there were night options for things that you could do, but it didn't matter what time you went to rest. I'm not sure why they just didn't say you had 12 hours and 12 hours minus 1 hour for every fatigue token you take. It would have made it much simpler. It works this way, but I don't know, I felt like it didn't really add to the gameplay or the story to have to rest. Now, I did play this game solo, and although the box says it can play up to 6 players, I can't really imagine playing this with more than 2, max 3 players. Technically, you can play with more, as the game is just fully cooperative and each player in turn gets to decide what lead to follow. But the characters you play don't change. You always start with 3, and there's nothing special about the characters, which is another issue I had with the game. Those starting characters which are with you for the entire game don't matter. They have no character. They're not involved with the story. Yes, they give you special abilities and the associated tokens, but beyond that, it doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter which ones I pick, why am I picking them? I would have loved for the game to say, if you have so-and-so in your party, read card X. If you don't, read card Y. They ended up just being like a resource you used, and not characters in the story itself. I became more invested in the people in the story on the cards than about the characters I was actually playing. And my last little nitpick is the kind of the illusion of choice this game offers. There are times in the game where you're given a choice and maybe pick up a keyword that can be used in a later chapter. But in reality, most of the time, it didn't alter the information you ended up getting. You could almost always get the same information from other sources if you didn't have that keyword. Even at the end of the last story, there are multiple endings, but they're not drastically different. The overall story concludes the same way. I wish there was more locked up information. If you didn't pick up this information on story 1, you missed a whole side story in chapter 3. But it just didn't work out that way, which means there's almost no replayability to this game. I know the story. I know what happened to the characters. I don't feel there's really much that I missed in the game. I don't need to go back and try a different path. So would I recommend this game? And from hearing me complain, you might think I'm going to say no, but I actually do recommend. I felt that the enjoyment I had playing the game outweighed the issues I had after I'd finished and looked back at what the game offered me. I finished the first story and was intrigued, and after the second one, I was actually looking forward to the final chapter. I really liked the story and the world this game is set in. You got to know a fair bit about the locals, the history, and the various nobles in their inner circle. It was enjoyable to work my way through the clues and try and piece together the different threads of the different stories to see how they all intertwined. I found it a very enjoyable experience. Not so much a game, but really as an experience. On the negative side though, I felt that sometimes the mechanisms got in the way of my enjoyment. The search, surveillance, and raid pieces felt a bit more like a guess as to when to use them than I would have liked. And I also wish there was more options in the game, more things to solve, more ramifications for my actions in previous stories. The whole game felt like an intro to a larger story. Yes, this mystery is done, and I'm not sure the mystery in the box really justifies the size of the box. It took me around a total of 4 hours to go through all 3 chapters, and with no replayability or other cases in the box, that does bring my rating down a little bit. I also find that the main mystery wasn't really difficult to solve. Yes, there were some deductions to be made based on the clues, but I didn't really find them overly difficult to follow. Overall though, I am going to give this game a 7.5 out of 10 in the Dice Tower seal of approval. If you like these styles of games, this is one I think you should probably try. It feels like reading a choose-your-own-adventure story or a mystery novel. It has a story to tell, which it does well, and you'll get to the end and have it explained to you. Although I did have some issues with it, I honestly felt it was worth the read. And that's it for the moment. Until next time, thanks for watching.